Nietzsche has about 3 criticisms of Christianity, and we'll deal with them all. First of all, he thinks just charity itself is nihilistic because it orients a person away from themselves. And I'll say more about that later, but you can be oriented towards your own life, or you can be oriented towards the flourishing of others. And if you're oriented towards the flourishing of others, then you're neglecting yourself. And whether you're 10% oriented towards the flourishing of others or 20% oriented towards the flourishing of others, you're still spending some portion of your time, some portion of your money directed away from your own life, denying the value of your own life, exalting someone else's life over your own. And Nietzsche thinks that that's nihilistic. You can disagree. It's fine. You can disagree. Just telling you, don't shoot the messenger. Nietzsche also thinks that Christianity is a scam. His wonderful work on the genealogy of morals is kind of all about this, how people of lower class invented this machine that would over time elevate the lower classes and denigrate the aristocracy to accomplish a rotation, so that the peasant class would take the aristocratic position and the aristocrats would fall into servitude. And this, because it couldn't be done militarily, because the peasants didn't have military might, was done ideologically by saying that poverty was goodness and wealth was evil. If you're talking good and bad, then it's good to be wealthy and bad to be poor. But this new ideology of good versus evil that meant wealth was evil because it was keeping, if you had wealth, you were keeping wealth from other people. And so it was good to be poor, to be without hoarded good things, because that means that other people can have them. And it's bad, not bad, evil to have lots of good things, because that means good things are kept from other people. It's a morality of kind of a zero-sum game. And Nietzsche thinks this is what Christianity is for, to make the aristocracy feel evil so that they undermine themselves, so that good people can rise up. And this is the problem with this interpretation for people, is that it's an explicitly biblical interpretation. Nietzsche doesn't quote Bible verses very much, or at all, I don't think, in the genealogy. But if you look at your Gospels, especially the Sermon on the Mount, it's explicit. The meek shall inherit the earth. It is harder for a rich man for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get inside a camel or something. So the problem is, for people, one of the things that's so offensive about that is that it seems to be right. Things can seem to be right without being right. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism tied up in Nietzsche's interpretation, although he seems to also hate anti-Semites. So equivocate that however you want. But if you just look at the criticism without looking at the man, there's a truthiness to it that then you see slave revolts everywhere. And the third thing he says is something that people are going to be very, very harmonious with, and that's the idea that the Christian metaphysics is not only nonsensical, but self-destructive. So the third way in which it's nihilistic, um, so it's nihilistic in that charity comports one away from oneself. Self-sacrifice comports one away from oneself. Perhaps more explicitly, maybe that's a better way to frame it, self-sacrifice. The morality of Christianity makes good things into evil things. I won't say that it makes good things seem evil. I will say that it actually does make good things into evil things, because it presents a definition of evil that is accepted, that includes this concept. And then the final thing is that Christianity is nihilistic because it puts an after world, which I think is the Kaufman translation of metaphysics. Metaphysics, that Aristotle, after what is physical. Kaufman says after the world. As I read through this, ask yourself whether Nietzsche is criticizing the idea of an afterworld, like a heaven or like a reincarnation, or like some other place where we go to when we die, or whether it's a general criticism that could be more broadly applied to anyone with a developed specific metaphysics at all. I think Kaufman's right in saying afterworldly rather than preserving the original metaphysics, because it really does seem to be about people who think you have more life after you die. But it's interesting that it's metaphysics in the original. So this idea that people then begin living according to moral principles that wouldn't make sense if their own lives were important to them right now. He's going to say that suffering is justified in a particular way because it penetrates through to an after. Suffering helps you penetrate through to an afterworld. Anyway, I'm going to go through this slowly because I want to get it right. I want to get it right, not because I'm pretentious, but because I think it's an easy chapter in Nietzsche. We're looking at page 30 from the Kaufman, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Sorry, Kaufman, I like spake more than spoke. So, hopefully that's the only word I get wrong, but it's my choice. I prefer it. Thus Spake Zarathustra. And I guess the original title would have been On Metaphysics, but here's Kaufman's given On the Afterworldly. At one time, Zarathustra too cast his delusion beyond man, like all the afterworldly. The work of a suffering and tortured God, the world then seemed to me. A dream the world then seemed to me. A fiction of God, colored smoke before the eyes of a dissatisfied deity. Good and evil, and joy and pain, and I and you, colored smoke, this seemed to me before the creative eyes. The Creator wanted to look away from himself, and so he created the world. Look at Crowley's note in Ontology, called Barashith, I think, where he says that, if you have an infinite God, then you have no room for anything else. Again, this zero-sum game thing. Even though the creator-creature distinction, there may actually be a creature who was created by a creator, but if the creator is infinite, then by comparison, the ratio between the amount of existence that is taken up by the God is infinitely larger than the amount of existence taken up by the finite creature. And so the finite creature ceases to be in the face of an infinite God who takes up all of the space that there is or could be. And so you're, even if you are trying to preach a doctrine of creator-creature distinction, if you have in your ontology this idea of an infinite, omnipresent, omnipotent deity, then the world just becomes a dream, whether you do that intellectually or whether it's subconscious, whether it's just about comportment. But smoke. What does he say? Good and evil, joy and pain, and I and you, colored smoke, these seem to me before the creative eyes. Drunken joy it is for the sufferer to look away from his suffering and to lose himself. The most famous thing in Nietzsche, well, I guess the most famous thing in Nietzsche is God is dead and we have killed him. But maybe the second most famous thing in Nietzsche is this idea of the opiate of the masses. Booze and religion are opiates of the masses. Here he's drawing this comparison by way of metaphor, saying that to look away from suffering and lose yourself is a type of drunken joy. So to imagine an afterworld, in the same way that drink does, it absolves you from dealing with the problems in the present world, because you can live in a fantasy instead of in your body. Drunken joy and loss of self, the world once seemed to me, this world eternally imperfect, an image of an eternal contradiction, an imperfect image, a drunken joy for its imperfect creator. Thus the world once appeared to me. Not only are we looking drunkenly away from our lives to an afterworld, but the creator of an afterworld, but the afterworld itself, the creator, the God who made this imperfect colored smoke, is entertaining himself by looking at us. So we're looking away from, so both the creator and creature are looking away from themselves, from their circumstances, into fantasy. The creator into the fantasy of the real, and the real into the fantasy of the afterworld. Thus I too once cast my delusion beyond man, like all the afterworldly. Beyond man indeed. I'm trying to spit that out because of the question mark. Nietzsche uses question marks to express dissatisfaction with an idea. It is almost theatrical. You need to perform it rather than see it on the page. Thus I too once cast my delusion beyond man, like all the afterworldly. Beyond man? Indeed. As if going beyond man is absurd, is ridiculous on its face. So someone said something utterly preposterous. Alas, my brothers, this God whom I created was man-made and madness, like all gods. Man he was, and only a poor specimen of man and ego. Out of my own ashes and fire this ghost came to me, and verily, it did not come to me from beyond. What happened, my brothers? I overcame myself, the sufferer. I carried my own ashes to the mountain. I invented a brighter flame for myself. And behold, then this ghost fled from me. Now it would be suffering for me and agony for the recovered to believe in such ghosts. Now it would be suffering for me and humiliation. Thus I speak to the afterworldly. He's going to give some mechanisms here in a little bit, but the first thing he says is just that he believed in God and heaven, and then he went to the mountain, and then he didn't. So what's the difference between being a city dweller who believes in God and a mountain dweller who doesn't? It's like camping, isn't it? You're living in a cave, you're sheltering from the storm, and there's always a present threat of starvation, of exposure, of there's always something in your life to do, to forage for food, to cook for yourself, to improve your environment. It's the next step is very, very clear whereas people who live in well-structured societies where there's a high degree of specialization have leisure time. That's what you don't have if you're living on a mountain. Hermits meditate all the fucking time, so I may be wrong about this in practical terms. But I think the point is that that he's recomported towards attending to himself. He doesn't have time to be distracted. And by kindling this brighter flame for himself, brighter flame, friction kindles flame. By doing this kind of hard work all the time, he developed a measure of pride and satisfaction with his life and didn't need to look to an afterworld. And now he's kind of embarrassed that he ever did. It was suffering and incapacity that created all afterworlds, this and that brief madness of bliss which is experienced only by those who suffer most deeply. Weariness that wants to reach the ultimate with one leap, with one fatal leap. A poor, ignorant weariness that does not want to want anymore. This created all gods and afterworlds. Oh, fuck, that hits so hard, doesn't it? A poor and ignorant weariness that does not want to want anymore. Sick of wanting things. Yeah, that's what does it. I mean, think of the I don't know if you've looked at any of this stuff about the Hindu caste system, the criticisms of the Hindu caste system. A lot, Buddha, I think, was critical of the Hindu caste system, and then later on, a lot of sort of yoga figures who defected to the West had this criticism that it was the dehumanizing of lower caste people, we call the untouchables, that do this terrible work, and the metaphysics is seen as a way to justify having them do this terrible work, because they're learning some lesson in this life that they can only learn by doing this terrible work and by being sort of ostracized from civilized life. And they shouldn't worry about it because it's only, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, however old one of these people happens to live. Probably not long if they spend all their time digging latrines and being around other people's excrement. And then they die, and then they get, once they've learned their lesson, a few hundred lifetimes as an untouchable, then maybe they can, there's other things they will be able to learn as a Brahmin or as a holy person. And so it's really easy for us to see this stuff when we look at other cultures, right? Because we're xenophobic. And so we can look at that and say, that's terrible. That's just a fucking excuse to keep people denigrated. We don't see the way in which a Christian heaven can do the same job, right? You're suffering. God will never put on you more than you can take. So bear your load. Carry your particular burden of poverty or whatever. So the meek shall inherit the earth. In the end times, not now. Weariness and want. A weariness that wants to reach the ultimate goal in one leap. Not work hard for it. One leap, one fatal leap. Just die. Just die, and then you'll have reached the ultimate goal. A poor and ignorant weariness that does not want to want anymore. This created all gods and afterworlds. Believe me, my brothers, it was the body that despaired of the body, and touched the ultimate walls with the fingers of a deluded spirit. Believe me, my brothers, it was the body that despaired of the earth, and heard the belly of being speak to it. It wanted to crash through these ultimate walls with its head, and not only with its head, over there to that world. But that world is well concealed from humans, that dehumanized, inhuman world, which is a heavenly nothing. And the belly of being does not speak to humans at all, except as a human. Verily, all being is hard to prove and hard to induce to speak. Tell me, my brothers, is not the strangest of all things proved the most nearly? He's making a rationalist argument now. I mean, we can't really reason our way to heaven. I mean, maybe we can, but we can't prove it. He's empirically, we don't find evidence. I think how near, and then he's putting an anti-rationalist or post-rationalist twist on it and saying, like, just how hard it is to prove things empirically. I mean, if it's so hard to even prove that I have a mind based on empirical evidence, hard to prove whether or not, like, let's say birds have feelings. If you can't prove something you know, for example, that beings have qualia, that there is something that it is like to be me, if I can't prove that, then how do I prove the strangest things, like that there's a heaven or like there's a God? Nietzsche's read Kant, the prolegomena to any future metaphysics, the question being how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? How can we put two ideas together without reference to the real world? And Nietzsche says Kant's answer is because of a faculty, which is obscuring the obscure by the more obscure. We just can. The answer, it's particularly biting criticism because it's the answer Kant is specifically trying to avoid giving, but Nietzsche read this book and thought this is the answer he gives. It's because of a faculty. Unfortunately, says Nietzsche, not in 5 words. Kant spends about 120 pages trying to do this thing about, is metaphysics even possible? And for those of us who spent, 4 months reading and rereading, trying to understand what Kant is saying in those 120 pages, it's particularly funny when Nietzsche says, because of a faculty, unfortunately not in 4 words. Nietzsche's echoing Kant's concern here. We just can't maybe do metaphysics at all. Indeed, this ego and the ego's contradiction and the confusion still speak most honestly of its being. This creating, willing, valuing ego, which is the measure and value of things, and this most honest being, the ego, speaks of the body and still wants the body, even when it poetizes and raves and flutters with broken wings. It learns to speak ever more honestly, this ego. And the more it learns, the more words and honors it finds for the body and earth. I should inflect that just a little differently. It learns to speak ever more honestly, this ego. And the more it learns, the more words and honors it finds for the body and earth. A new pride my ego taught me, and this I teach men, no longer to bury one's head in the sand of heavenly things, but to bear it freely, an earthly head, which creates a meaning for the earth. This is the second of the three mechanisms Nietzsche is going to point to. The first was leading a more active life, having work to do every day, perhaps leaving the city and going to the mountain. That will make you more invested in your own life and ameliorate some of the need for these future-looking fantasies, this idea of being, having a continued life post-death. But the second thing is that the sincerity of the aspiration actually has a boomerang effect. The more you reach up towards this idea of a life beyond, there's an absurd quality to it. Maybe I want to call it like an absurd quality to it. Maybe I want to call it like a cognitive dissonance, because you want to overcome your suffering in one leap, but you do want to overcome your suffering. The motivation is to penetrate beyond present life circumstances. So the more sincerely you aspire to this afterlife, and the more sort of nihilistic you become because of that, the more distance you put between yourself and your, Nietzsche calls it the body, but between yourself and your material conditions, the more you're likely to strive up. And eventually, the problem with cognitive dissonance is hopefully, eventually, it breaks. And you realize that the strain you're putting on yourself by aspiring, the suffering you're creating by removing yourself more and more from your own life up towards an afterlife, hopefully that will sort of turn all at once back into a realization of what you can actually do to alleviate your real suffering. And this crisis can be very emotional. I mean, people can be desperate and miserable if they realize what they're doing is inconsequential. But even if what they're doing is inconsequential, they've developed the tools for striving. Striving towards an afterlife is still striving. And so it makes you stronger and makes you more able to deal with your immediate circumstances. So the delusion breaks itself if it's pursued with zeal. Anew I will teach, sorry, it's unusual syntax. Anew will I teach men to will this way which man has walked blindly, and to affirm it, and no longer to sneak away from it like the sick and dying. So men walk through their lives blindly, willing an afterlife. And he wants to teach you a new way to will, to comport yourself toward the way you were actually going, to will your own life as it is, to bear your head freely, an earthly head, which creates a meaning for the earth. A new way I will teach man, to will this way which man has walked blindly, and affirm it, and no longer to sneak away from it like the sick and decaying. It was the sick and decaying who despised the body and earth and invited the heavenly realms and the redemptive drops of blood. But they took even these sweet and gloomy poisons from the body and earth. They wanted to escape their own misery, and the stars were too far for them, so they sighed. Would that there were heavenly ways to sneak up into another state of being and happiness. Thus they invented their sneaky ruses and bloody potions. Ungrateful, these people deemed themselves transported from their bodies and this earth. But to whom did they owe the convulsions and raptures of their transport? To their bodies and the earth. This is the precede of what's going to happen later in the genealogy of morals, where he's going to detail how this conspiracy of the sick against the healthy actually happens. He doesn't necessarily mean bodily sick. He doesn't mean they all have to be lepers, but morally sick, socially sick, this sort of a thing. And how that sickness leads them to invent an afterworld, and then to preach it. You might think this would entice a person to revenge, but Zarathustra says no. Zarathustra is gentle with the sick. Verily, he is not angry with their kinds of comfort and ingratitude. Because if you live for yourself, you aren't affected as deeply by the bad attitudes and bad philosophies and bad ideas of other people. You know, if you are really oriented towards your own flourishing, if you know that you are what you need, not exclusively, but primarily, that's what allows you to be tolerant. So when you see this sort of intolerance, censorship, and revulsion, this whole class of people that we think of as deplorables now, the disgust of the left toward the deplorables on the uneducated right is because of the lack of self-confidence on the left. You see these debates between like bad people who hold rightist views and leftists who are supposedly, they have the same amount of education, the same amount of background, but the person on the right almost always wins these sorts of arguments, not because they're smarter and not because they're correct, but because the leftist hasn't bothered to prepare. They just assume their ideas are better, and so they will win the debate. And they get all angry and they start yelling and they have no self-confidence. They believe in their minds that their ideas are socially superior, and so they don't devote the intellectual rigor to defending them, because they can't, because they don't have the self-confidence. They're just cowardly a lot, and it's really sad because I'm a leftist, and we need a better class of leftists. Zarathustra is gentle with the sick. Verily, he's not angry with their kinds of comfort and ingratitude. Because when the leftists get angry, they look ridiculous against the few against educated members of the right, and then while leftists may think they win these debates by pure outrage, and the people that would vote Democratic anyway get more radically invested in voting for bad Democratic candidates, while the people on the right are galvanized by the seeming intellectual superiority of their positions, because their dorky leaders, who should be easily called out by smarter people, are the smartest people in the room, because the left don't bother. They don't fucking bother. And it galvanizes the position on the right to extremism, because the defenselessness of the left against those ideas seems to prove that holding those extreme forms, that holding more and more extreme forms of those ideas makes you more and more correct. I should just let Nietzsche be Nietzsche. Zarathustra is gentle with the sick. Verily, he is not angry with their kinds of comfort and ingratitude. May they become convalescents, men of overcoming, and create a higher body for themselves. Nor is Zarathustra angry with the convalescent who eyes his delusion tenderly at midnight, sneaks around this grave of his God. But even so, his tears still betray sickness and a sick body to me. So I don't know whether this paragraph is about just letting suffering take its course, become convalescent, become sicker, become bedridden. Is that what he means? I'm not angry with these people because I know eventually they're going to get sick and die, and that's what they want, and that's what I want for them. So fuck that whole noise. Or is this, or maybe it's motivated by what he says earlier, this mechanism of striving up makes you stronger so that you can turn and be reoriented towards strength. Maybe it's both. Maybe you let the healthy people rise and the sick people wither. Not particularly attached to that as a leftist, but maybe that's what he's pointing at. Many sick people have always been among the poetizers and the God-cravers. Furiously they hate the lover of knowledge and the youngest among the virtues, which is called honesty. They always look backward toward the dark ages. Then indeed delusion and faith were another matter. The rage of reason was God-likeness, and doubt was sin. The leftists are scared of Nietzsche because his values are antithetical to all of theirs. I mean, it's fine to be scared of Nietzsche if you're leftist, because he's anti-charity and anti-self-sacrifice. And those are core, lefty values. But look how like a leftist he sounds here. He's saying that religious people are trapped in the Dark Ages. This is a key bit of lefty rhetoric when we talk about the sort of uneducated rural deplorables. We're always pointing at what we think of as a radical Christian rural right. The establishment left are as intolerant of these people as Nietzsche is. And the radical left is even more intolerant. This is a leftist position now. Many sick people have always been among the poetizers and God-cravers. Furiously, they hate the lover of knowledge and that youngest among virtues, which is called honesty. Yeah, Christians hate knowledge. They hate the truth. They always look backward toward the Dark Ages. Then, indeed, delusion and faith were another matter. The rage of reason was godlikeness, and doubt was sin. Criticisms of preachers now and TV evangelists. I know these godlike men all too well. They want one to have faith in them, and all doubt to be sin. All too well, I also know what it is in which they have the most faith. Verily, it is not in afterworlds and redemptive drops of blood, but in the body, that they too have the most faith. and their body is to them their thing in itself. But a sick thing it is to them, but a sick thing it is to them, and gladly would they shed their skins. Therefore they listen to the preachers of death, and themselves preach afterworlds. Listen rather, my brothers, to the voice of the healthy body. That is a more honest and pure voice. More honestly and purely speaks the healthy body that is perfect and perpendicular, and it speaks of the meaning of the earth. Thus spake Zarathustra.